Hi gang, David Michael Phelps here. Our guest today on Working Man is Phil Sotok. Phil is an entrepreneur and businessman with over 20 years experience in the automotive industry. Phil is also the founder of DPMC North America, a firm that helps companies reorient their cultures around unifying purposes. And on today's episode, Phil and I discuss the two core virtues for building a healthy, life-giving community in a business. We discuss how virtuous leadership is different than competent management, and why it's important to make sure that what you say you value is reflected in what you actually do at work. Phil's a thoughtful guy who cares deeply about helping people remember that business is essentially a human enterprise, and I think you're going to like what he has to say. So without further ado, here's Phil Sotok.
I grew up in this area in Holland, Michigan. I was born in the Detroit area, but spent most of my life here. Went to Hope College, graduated there in the, let's just say, the early 90s. And then took some time and moved to Mexico City to take a job there. Went to grad school and then took a job with Chrysler Corporation. And after Chrysler Corporation, I guess it might be interesting because I started my career, if you want to call it that, at Prince Corporation. And Prince Corporation is no longer around, but they were a very large automotive, what we call tier one, that did all sorts of interior type componentry, electronics and so forth. And I was fortunate to start mowing, I was in their beautification department, they called it, which was essentially I got to mow lawns around their facilities. But then I took a job, working on the line and doing other things there. And I didn't know it at the time. I probably worked there from the time I was 16 until maybe 22. Had no idea that was an abnormal business. And abnormal, what I mean by that is the way they ran that business was very purposeful. It was very centered on the human person in work, how they treated people. They even have a people center, and they just went above and beyond to create this, or try to create this atmosphere of community. But it was also it was a challenging place to work. The expectations were very high there. But they created this really amazing culture that I was just like, okay, this is what business is. This is what it feels like. And so fast forward, I end up taking my first job out of grad school with Chrysler Corporation. And Chrysler was one of the best of, it was the best of the big three culturally, we can say. And I kind of started to realize shortly in that what I had experienced at this company called Prince Corporation was really unique, and how they treated people was really something unique and special. And so I had kind of an inflection point probably 5 years into my career at Chrysler where I had to make a choice on whether or not I wanted to, in order to succeed at Chrysler, I needed to become a certain way. And I had to behave a certain way. And those behaviors and that way of being was incongruent to the values that I was starting to embrace more, and maybe even starting to preach a bit. And so I had to make that choice of do I want to sacrifice this picture of what I believe is leadership and what work means to maybe to meet a certain financial goal or a certain status of a certain rung on the ladder or a certain status of job title. So I chose to leave Chrysler around the age of 30 and tried to start my own business. And that was I think I saw entrepreneurship, or I think when I was at Chrysler, I started to understand that I had a desire for entrepreneurship, and I didn't quite know why yet. It just was drawing me in, this idea that if you could create something from nothing, or if you could create something that never existed before and build it, that was really exciting to me and really interesting. And so I set out with the simple goal of creating a really cool place to work. I didn't have much of a business model. I was playing around with different ideas of what that business could potentially do and make or build or whatever. But it really was predicated just on creating an environment where people could really try to fulfill, their potential. And it started there. So I started a business in the early 2000s in automotive because that was my experience and that's what I knew. And that business has gone through its ups and downs, but has grown from nothing to, we have technical offices in Shanghai and Mexico, in Barcelona, Spain, and then we're here in Zeeland, Michigan. So it's had a nice run.
It's funny. We jump right into the whole culture and community of a company right away. For the first time this week, I watched. Have you seen Ford versus Ferrari?
Not yet. No, I do want to see that though.
I watched it twice this week, and it was 1:00 in the morning when I finished it. That's the only reason I didn't watch it again right then.
Right.
It was really very enjoyable and on a lot of levels. But one of the things, and I recommend you watch it, but one of the things that really stands out in that film is how it avoids a lot of stereotypes about business culture, about entrepreneurship, about the life of a working man, about creativity, all these things. So it doesn't shy away from the complexity of those things, but it also shows how the culture of a company can kind of take on its own driving character for good or for ill, and that the people involved in the company, the people involved in the enterprise, have choices to make about whether or not that culture is going, if it's a bad culture, if it's going to find them, or to what extent they're going to try to make it into a good culture. And
Right.
and as I listened to you talk about your experience, I'm like, man, there's a movie called Ford versus Ferrari, and it's exactly what you just said. So let me ask you this question: when you think about the cultures of the companies you've been involved in or you've built,
Mm-hmm.
and as you look at sort of this pivotal experience early on with Prince, why did that happen at that company?
Yeah, I think, in West Michigan, I think a lot of it is grounded in the beliefs of the entrepreneurs and the leaders who start and build these businesses, and they build them around, whether it's the idea of servant leadership or steward leadership or just values-based leadership, whatever you want to call it. It's all its genesis comes from the same philosophical belief, or the belief that there's dignity in the person and there's potential in the person. And if we can figure out how to grab onto that potential and harness that potential, and maybe harness it in a collective nature, right, where we bring people together, right, and we harness that collective potential, that can create something really powerful and really good. And so I think entrepreneurs they're wired in that way because they're wired to create, they're wired to ask the questions, they're wired to challenge the status quo. And I think they also have, I'm generally speaking, but I think entrepreneurs in general have this idea that whatever I want to accomplish, I'm not going to be able to accomplish it alone. Right. And so I need to figure out how to, show people this vision, get them on board with this vision, and then harness the best that they have to bring to this idea of the future that I'm trying to create. Whether that's, in the case of Prince, it wasn't that complex of a vision. Now, they had a mission to become, whatever, number one, tier one automotive interior supplier in the United States, or whatever their mission was. But if you dig down into what their vision was, and probably what their underlying purpose was, it was just to build community. And so you can see it. You can see this idea of building community in the people that were working there. They were literally building communities of people within Prince Corporation, within the organization itself. But then that manifests itself, as it should, because any organization that is truly authentic to their purpose doesn't just do it in a little vacuum right here. It can't help it. It does it everywhere. So Prince was very active in the community, building up, downtown Holland or Evergreen Commons or whatever. But you could see this idea of community building for prosperity and for this idea of, common good for all, that was just pumping out of this organization. And so its legacy really isn't the fact that it sold for a buttload of money to Johnson Controls. Its legacy is it had hundreds of leaders who grew up in this organization and saw this idea and this way of running a business and saw that it was good and saw the good that it could do. And so do you intentionally set out to do that? I mean, some maybe do, I think some values driven leaders set out to create a place that's really great to work, right? And is life-giving to people. And I think others set out to create a business that's successful and profitable and does well by its stakeholders. And then, along the way realizes that, they got to work on their culture and get their culture right because, some things just aren't working as well as they'd hoped. So I don't know how people come to that recognition that at the end of the day, what drives the organization is the people within the organization. You cannot escape that. It's a human-centered endeavor.
Yeah. What are the barriers for people to create a culture? You've used this, you speak a lot about purpose and values-driven, cultures. Unpack that a little bit for me. How does that help build that community?
Well, yeah, I mean, different leaders have different leadership styles, and you could go to a Harvard Business Review and read something, I'm sure, about the 5 attributes of great leaders, and it's going to give you this list of things that you need to work on if you want to be a great leader or whatever. But I think leadership is, and I read this from Alexander Havard, who wrote the book Virtuous Leadership. It really boils down to this dance between 2 overarching leadership virtues. One is this idea of a magnanimous vision of the future, or this aspirational vision of the future, if you want to call it that, coupled with the practice of genuine humility. Not false humility, but genuine humility. And if you have one without the other, if you have just a magnanimous vision without the humility, I'm sure we could probably list a few leaders out there who have the magnanimous side of the equation down really well, but the humility side of it is lacking. And so we look at that leadership and we say, yeah, they're accomplishing great things, but I don't know that I'd want to be that person, because it seems like they're sacrificing a lot in order to be that or do that. And then you can see the humble leader without the magnanimous vision, and that's not very compelling or drawing either, because they don't allow themselves, because they're drawn too much into the idea of humility. They don't allow themselves to think big. They don't allow themselves to have a vision of the future that might change the status quo, because there's something that's not humble about that. And so I think the combination of these two is what we see. We can unpack that in any great leader. You can, I mean, the obvious example is Jesus, right? Had both of those dialed in to a point that we can't even necessarily understand how he was able to do that. But you see glimpses of that in people that have those 2 virtues dialed in really well. And so I think those are 2 of the overarching virtues that we need to learn and embrace and really practice.
It's so funny. We've been having these sort of conversations for a few months now. Somehow, I'd say, 90% of these conversations so far somehow redound back to humility. And I don't know, I mean, it always comes up. And you made a distinction between, you were real quick to say genuine humility as opposed to false humility. What do you mean by that?
Well, I've been trying to understand that myself. It may go back to, I was challenged once by someone who had said, you've got to check your false humility. And I didn't quite understand what he meant by that. And I'm still trying to understand that fully. But I think there's a tendency that we have to do things that we feel good about. And so I can give money from my business, through my business, individually, those types of things, right? And there's a slippery slope about the humility that's wrapped up in all of that, and that idea of giving and why am I giving? And so I think when we get down to the root of, when I'm talking about genuine humility, I'm talking about the choices that we're making that are truly outward focused, right? That there's this outward mindset that I'm making this choice not for me, but I'm making it for you. And I think the line that gets confused is, I'm really making this choice for me, but I'm going to package it as if it were for you. And that's very manipulative. And I think we see that a lot in leadership in organizations that have good intentions and they're trying to do the right thing, but they're packaging it in a way that they want you to believe that this is for you, when really it's about me. It's about whatever goals that I have. It's about whatever vision that I have. And it starts to slide into paternalism. It starts to become very paternalistic, where it's like, I know what's best for you. And it's not intentional. You know what I mean? Like, it's so tricky not to catch that. You know, we're educated, we have experience, we have wisdom, we have all sorts of things that we can apply to this world and to help other people. But it's a very slippery slope when we get into that I know best, or I'm really doing this for me, but I'm packaging it, you know, like it's for you. And I think that's something that we all struggle with.
Yeah. And it seems to me too, there's an especial danger that if you have a magnanimous vision or you have this excellent purpose, that can sometimes lead to abuses of its own sort. You know, it's the old saying, you know, the higher the angel, the lower the demon, right? And you know, it's possible for people to, in the name of God, do terrible things or treat people poorly, right? Yeah. You have to be careful of that, because the vision, if it's externalized too far, you can almost turn it into an idol and then use that thing as the excuse you need to manipulate other people. It takes some sort of skin in the game in that vision in order to avoid a danger like that, I would imagine.
Well, and that's why I think that the two virtues of magnanimity and humility, at least when we're talking about leadership and entrepreneurship, are critical, because they're really our first defense against the vices, the pride, the ego, you know, the greed, whatever, the lust, whatever vice, you know, drives you. We all have a vice that kind of is our pitfall, let's say, right? And so I'll give you an anecdote that I thought was really powerful, and it drove this idea of virtue and vice home for me. I had the opportunity, I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago, to go out to Hobby Lobby, and we took a group of like 8 business leaders from West Michigan out to sit with them for a day and their senior leadership team. And I guess I didn't know they did this. I think they do it for free. Like, I don't recall paying anything for it. So they put their senior leadership team in front of this other group to kind of, you know, just ask questions and kind of talk about the history of the business and how they think and their challenges and whatever. So it started out, I didn't know I was going to meet David Green, but David Green walks in, who was the founder of Hobby Lobby, right? He's probably like 75. And he sits down, and within the first minute, you can see his genuine humility within the first minute. And the first story he chose to tell everyone was a story about the day he found himself curled up in a ball underneath his desk, sobbing uncontrollably because he was going to lose the business. And he said, it was at that moment that I knew my vice had gripped me. And he said, my vice is pride. It's absolutely pride. And he said, I was so afraid and so attached to this thing that I had created that it was going to take me down with it. And he said, from that day forward, he essentially set out to structure and grow the business with the virtues in such a way that would balance that vice of his pride. So if you look at how they've structured the business, how they run the business, their systems, and that you can see little hints of, you know, this is like, you're almost intentionally doing this to curb this tendency for people to have pride, in too much pride, excessive pride, right? And so it's the humility, it was the Spartan nature of their facilities, for example, right? Their corporate offices were converted warehouses, right? Kind of like the whole Walmart thing, right? So but you could see it kind of woven into their DNA. was this recognition that his pitfall was pride. And so it's just, like it's pretty complicated, like when you look at a guy who's accomplished that, and the first thing he wants to tell you is the vice that can bring him down at any moment in time. You would think he would sit down and tell you all the awesome things that he did and why you should be like him. But he didn't. He said, be warned. This is what happened to me. That was his message. I thought that was powerful.
What's interesting to me too, and listening to you talk, is be it business specifically or work more generally, I think for a lot of people, it might sound old-fashioned to be using words like virtue and vice as somehow operational in success or leadership or whatever you want to say, as opposed to, whatever skills or competencies you have or business acumen or whatever it is, right? To be able to speak so much about virtue, vice. Do you think that's true? Do people react that way? Like, oh, this sounds old-fashioned or maybe even basic?
I don't know how they react, to be honest. That's a good question. I've never really stopped to think about how they, there you go. I just kind of talk about it. But I think it's the difference between management and leadership. We have been taught and trained to be managers. And then we get into the workplace and we have to go through a retraining to become leaders, a reskilling. That's why the leadership industry is massive, because there's no shortage of people that we need to reskill, right? Because we come out as objective, goal-oriented, taskmasters. And we're taught it. The schools are structured that way. The universities are structured that way. STEM, all these, you can see it. Like it's pretty obvious we're coming out as, as robotic, taskmasters and goal and objective, oriented. So I think that's, when I talk about those, the virtues and the vices, you're really getting at our human nature. And if anybody wants to be a leader of people, you have to get at the core. You have to get at the beliefs. You have to get at why people tick, like why they do what they do, before you can start to understand how to drive behaviors. You know what I mean? Like if you want certain outcomes, certain behaviors in an organization, you can't start with the tools and the incentives. You have to start with the beliefs, right? And then once you understand the beliefs and how those attach and drive the behaviors, then you can start to structure systems and policies and procedures, whatever, around that complement that, right? That bring that out instead of hinder it. Like Wells Fargo is a perfect example. I'm sure you know the story of how they incentivized middle managers to open up fake accounts, right? Well, it's really funny interesting because if you had seen any of their marketing material up until then and through that time, it was all about integrity and trust. And so it's like, okay, well, if that's what you believe, okay, that's what you believe, but then you're coming at it from the opposite perspective with incentives that are driving incongruent behaviors to what you believe. So you have this belief, and then you have this structure in the organization that's driving behavior. And they missed it. They completely missed that. And now they've spent billions of dollars trying to convince us that they've reinvented themselves around trust again. It's like, okay, burn me once.
Yeah, it's the same story that if you've got an organization where the system or the structure is set up in such a way that it is out of keeping with some human purpose, at the very least, there's just going to be continual tension there, right?
Yep.
It seems to me, though, that if you're talking about getting into like human formation, right? I mean, that's the managerial skills. Those are sort of tools. But leadership is the cultivation of a certain type of human being. Today, that prospect itself is the very foundations of that idea is difficult to walk through. Yeah, because we live in a culture now where what is a human, and what can people do, and who should they be? These are all questions that are radically up in the air. So, what sorts of challenges do you see in in being able to draw attention to forming humans, to forming leaders, to forming these virtues in the context where everything's up in the air culturally.
To be honest, all of this is so new. What I thought maybe 6 months ago or 3 months ago is changing so quickly. And I'm almost paralyzed, to be honest, with what's the reaction, or how do we deal with this or address this or talk about it or whatever, that it's got me at a bit of a loss and a bit concerned, just because I feel like we're heading in a direction that if you have anything, if you've created, like as a business owner and entrepreneur, let's just keep it in the business context. If you're an entrepreneur or business owner and you have anything and you've created it, you've built it, maybe you've inherited, whatever, you have it. That society is saying that the only reason you have that is because the system was in your favor. So you really don't deserve it. And we need to take that back. And that's a scary proposition for anybody in business, certainly private business, right? Let's talk about the moms and the pops and the small business owners. I'm not talking about Google and Amazon and these guys that are seemingly untouchable. I'm talking about the people that started something from nothing, that have built community around that have family members involved in that, whatever. And they've built something that's good for the community, right? And now that's being said, well, you didn't do that on your own doing. And so from a perspective of, do I want to go out and start a business in that environment? Probably. I mean, that's a scary thing to think about. Do I even want to pay? Well, I won't use but would somebody want to pay taxes in that scenario? So you can see the potential that has of bringing this idea of free market, entrepreneurship, ingenuity, creativity, creation, building. It flies in the face of all of that. And so that's what I'm trying to wrestle with right now, is how do you have the conversation? Because the conversation isn't about, it's wrapped up in this inclusivity and the racism conversation and gender politics and all these types of things. But it's really two ideologies, one that's built on building and creating, and one that's built on destroying and knocking down. And I don't know how to have that conversation yet with the average person who's just trying to make a living and feed their family. It's just a really crazy situation, but it's not what I'll say. It's not about racism, and it's not about inclusivity. It's about two ideologies. One that's built on a capitalistic growth, prosperity, lifting people out of poverty through business, versus one that's based on the opposite of that.
Yeah. And I would say perhaps even one step deeper is 20 years ago when I was in school, and so I studied English. At that point, it's still at least a debate. There's really not a debate anymore. But in those days, it was still this question about what is going to drive what we value, what is going to drive how we find meaning in things. And the ascendant ideology at the time, which is now the dominant ideology, is this notion that there really isn't anything but power to answer that question. Whoever has the power gets to determine what the meaning is. And there's really nothing outside of it, be it community, be it culture, be it tradition, be it faith, anything. There's nothing that can sort of provide a meaning, a deep common meaning that we can all have. And so this is really just a big power play, and whoever has the power gets to call the shots about what's meaningful. And so every analytical tool we understand to approach our lives gets reduced to power. Yeah. And there's only one thing. There's only one thing to do if that's the determining factor, and it's destroy those who are in your way. That's it. Yeah. You can't talk them into it. You can't anything. It's destruction, right. And it's very concerning to me to see how something that seems like it might be just an ideological debate in academia in the next generation turns into its own sort of anti-culture. Yeah. And a culture, I think you're exactly right. It's a culture of destruction. because it's rooted in something like envy, and ultimately it's rooted in it's rooted in its own vice. It's rooted in a type of pride. I will not bend to anyone, even God, even meaning. I will be the one that says what is meaningful. You can grow. It takes a while. It takes a season to grow a garden. It takes a night to burn it down. And whatever the answer is, we'll have to be in it for the long game, the long, slow game.
Well, and I think we've got to stay focused on the role that we can play in society. And if you're a business leader, I think a big role that you can play is giving hope, genuine hope that, there's hope for the future. There's hope for your family. There's hope for your kids. There's hope for your grandkids. And that's just that's the power of forming community around an endeavor that a group of people are pointed at accomplishing. And I think if we keep our eyes, slanted, tilted upward toward this idea of co-creating, and, we're given this time and this privilege on earth to continue the creation, so to speak, then that's all we can do. And we just have to keep pushing that. And that's why I think entrepreneurship and business and work in general is so critically important, because it's the manifestation. It's our ability. It's our means of manifesting our purpose. And in manifesting our purpose, we create meaning for ourselves. And the problem with some of the other ideologies, it's saying you don't have to work. You shouldn't work. You're entitled to things that you don't need to work for because of something that happened, in the past. And so what it's doing is it's essentially evacuating meaning. Like, it's intentionally pulling meaning out of the equation. When I say you're entitled to something, I've just taken meaning out of the conversation. So the strategy or the idea is, if we can suck any potential for people to create meaning in their lives, then they become absolutely dependent upon us for that meaning. And then we can tell them what's meaningful in life.
Yeah.
And they'll listen because they don't know any better.
And they don't have any other options at that point.
And they have no other options. And they have no other necessarily skills to apply.
Yeah.
And so it's a really scary proposition. It's essentially a cycle of death.
Yeah.
Physically and spiritually. But it's what we have to fight against, because we're the ones in the world, broadly speaking, those who are trying to build things are the ones that are essentially the antidote to that. And for some reason, I don't know how it's gotten so strong so quickly. We have gone from good to bad overnight. We're the problem. And I don't understand that yet. I can't wrap my head around how somebody would get to that belief that, other than, dwelling on the corruption, right? There is corruption. Of course, there's corruption everywhere, and there's corruption in capitalism. We know that. Yeah.
Even the word itself to me is instructive, because that really, it is a corruption of culture. And if you take it almost literally, a corruption is a dying away and a withering and a disease of culture, right? Is corruption. And I think that, obviously there are cases where corruption is so far gone, there's so little, health in the limb, you have to amputate it, right?
Yeah.
Now you have to be careful of a treatment like that, because that's irreversible.
Yeah.
But in the face of corruption, as in the face of vice, stamping out corruption or stamping out vice, I think is most often and best done not by stamping it out or trying to destroy it, but by inculcating virtue and strength and health.
Yeah.
Right. So the best medicine for a healthy life is not to destroy everything that is getting in your way, but it's to build up the things that are that are life-giving. And
yes.
And I love that you went to hope, because hope when I was young, felt like some sort of ethereal, off in the distance, isn't that nice dream, as
Yeah.
opposed to hope is this thing that we do today, and is this thing that we build today. Building those virtues of hope incarnately, right, by working, getting to work, seems to me to be a reason for hope, and maybe that's the best we can do. And you know what? Maybe that's the best we could ever have done, was just that.
Yeah.
Those simple things.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to highlight is hope is not found. Hope is created. You know what I mean? Like, it's like if we have this idea that hope is around the corner, we just need to find it out there. It's under a rock. It's in us inherently, because meaning is in us inherently. Dignity is in us inherently. And so it's something that we have to cultivate. That takes work, takes intentionality, but that was Frankel's whole point in the concentration camps, is the people that had lost hope were the ones that didn't make it. And the people that created hope somehow were the ones that survived. So it's really interesting. You know, the I don't want to, I talked about corruption and some of that stuff, and I am very hopeful about, some of the trends that are happening, even in big business, with this idea of, business has to be or go beyond the sole purpose of wealth or shareholder value, and it has to have a purpose beyond that. And I think, the fact that some pretty big names are talking about this, hopefully they're talking about it in a genuine way, is starting to get at this idea that business and work is something that is meant to do good and can and should do good by all. Society, the global society, the local community, the employees, of course the shareholders, all the stakeholders. And so I think it's a very, it's a secular way, in my opinion, it's a secular way of talking about the church's teachings in the vocation of the business leader around the importance of Catholic social doctrine and the pillars of that doctrine being, human dignity, common good, subsidiarity, solidarity, outreach, justice. Unfortunately, social justice now has been hijacked, and it doesn't mean what we've been talking it to mean for years and years. But so I do think there's a movement out there, even though it's, wrapped in secular verbiage, that's very consistent with the teachings of the church and what work and how business ought to be structured.
Yeah. You made a distinction there between shareholder and stakeholder. Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Well, shareholder is a stakeholder. So if you just think of, different businesses have different stakeholders, but what you would mean by a stakeholder is anybody that has a vested interest in the business. That could be the community. Certainly it's society at large. If you're talking about, let's say, an oil, company or something who shouldn't be polluting or should be doing the right thing there. But employees are stakeholders, right? They have a vested interest in the business, partners, suppliers. So you have a handful of stakeholders. And what I think a lot of the discussion is starting to trend toward is it's not just about the shareholder value that you're creating. It's about this broader stakeholder value that you ought to create and you need to create if you want a sustainable business. So the key is on sustainability, which is not sustainability in an environmental sense, although you could think that way, but sustainability in the good that business can do in a sustainable way. There's no value to grow a business over 10, 20, 30 years and then have it disappear. You know what I mean? Unless it's a bad business or it's not contributing to society. But the intent is we should be able to create these things that create sustainable value for a basket of stakeholders for the duration. And so that's what I mean by the difference between the stakeholder and the shareholder is, the argument is if we overly focus on the shareholder, then we get what we get, which is this 90-day treadmill of trying to beat the market. And the consequences that come from the choices that need to be made to run on that 90-day treadmill can be very damaging to the other stakeholders. So it was a model that was shareholder number one at the expense of all else. And now what they're saying is, Now you've got to balance your stakeholders, and you really shouldn't focus on any one stakeholder for any duration of time at the expense of the other, right? I mean, if you're in a crisis like now, it's probably prudent to focus on your shareholder, because you got to get the business to survive. And if it doesn't survive, you're going to do more harm than good potentially. But if you only focus there and you focus there for too long, you're eventually going to do it at the expense of somebody else. So the challenge now becomes, as business leaders, is how do we balance the interests of all the stakeholders, and how do we do that in a way that's sustainable and drives value? And the answer to that is, well, if you do that, it is a more sustainable and a higher value driving approach and model for the business. So you got to learn how to do that. I mean, most of my work is in this realm of purpose and helping organizations, figure out what it means to authentically live the purpose that they believe they have. And I think too many leaders believe that once they've articulated it, communicated a purpose, both internally and externally, their job is done. And that's actually just where it begins, because the hard part of that whole equation is the how-to part of now that I've professed this vision for the future and this reason for being of the organization, how am I going to ensure that it's designed and structured in every facet of the organization, whether it's the strategies we develop or the systems that we adhere to, or even the leadership practices that we teach? How is that congruent, and how does that connect back to this idea that we have for why we exist? And a lot of leaders stumble on that. They get the importance of stating purpose, right? Because it's inspiring and it draws people to a vision. But they stumble when it comes to the choices that they have to make every day through that lens, because we haven't been taught how to think about business through the lens of purpose on a day-to-day basis. We've been taught to manage it through other means. And that's fine. I think we need to continue to manage it through those means, but we have to be putting the choices that we have every day through this broader lens. So that's where I spend a lot of time, and I'm passionate about helping leaders get their arms around that challenge, because that's the whole sustainability aspect of it. If we get that right, we have a fighting chance.
Hey, as always, thanks for listening to Working Man. And before we sign off, just a quick update here on Harmel Academy. We're speeding toward the fall, and as we look ahead at our first batch of young men who will be attending Harmel Academy of the Trades, it's a truly humbling thing to know that this idea for a Catholic trade school is becoming a reality. Now, part of what's humbling about it is knowing how important the work is that we're trying to do, this work of forming young men to love Christ, to be excellent craftsmen, and to build the next generation of community and culture, to raise the next generation of families, to build the next generation of the church. The way the world has gone recently, it's pretty easy to get discouraged, but when I see the young men ready to get to work at Harmel, I rediscover a kind of hope. And I hope that when you see these Harmel students in action in the coming months and in the coming years, you'll be encouraged as well. But just as you can imagine, this is work we can't do by ourselves. We need your help. So please continue to share what we're doing with your friends, with your family, with your priest. Please consider pitching in a little money to help us with the day-to-day operations of the Academy. You can donate at harmelacademy.org/donate. And of course, always, please keep us in your prayers. However it is you can help us, it's appreciated. And I know that it's going to make a generational difference. So, thank you.